Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. Devin, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. Very excited.
So I wanted to tell a story and to get your opinion in it, and it involves your book.
Okay.
It's called So Many Ways to Lose, the Amazing True Story of the New York Mets, the best, worst team in sports. So last October, I was at a friend's vacation house. The entire family spent the weekend there. And as a gift, I brought him your book. Now, this just so happened to be the weekend before the National League Championship Series versus the Dodgers. And of course, he said, it's kind of an auspicious gift to give, which I had anticipated, a little jinxy, but I'm like, yeah, it's the Mets. Yeah. And a week later, of course, things turned out as the way that they often did.
Went as they did. Yeah.
And the Mets lost. So I thought, wasn't such a bad gift after all. But I feel like in other fandoms, if I were to do that, I would be banished to being a cricket fan. Is that okay, in your opinion, to have made that gift the weekend before the National League Championship Series, a book called So Many Ways to Lose?
If you catch the kind of Mets fan that I aspire to be, I would appreciate the bit. I didn't think we were going to beat the Dodgers. So, I think that particular Mets team too, we spent that entire month playing with house money and having that feeling, waking up every day being kind of like, I can't believe this is still going and going and going. And I think because of that, coming up against the Dodgers, I think we thought there was a chance maybe we could hang with them, but it pretty quickly became clear that they were not in flop mode. You know what I mean? Like you would have to see pretty early that maybe something wasn't coming together about that team in that series. And very quickly it was evident that no, they were really good. They were not going to screw up. They were not going to fumble this away. And they were a much better team.
And I mean, evidenced by how quickly they beat the Yankees as well. So, it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think what was so fascinating, there are two ways of looking at this past season through the prism of how I tend to look at it, which is this, the way I write about it in my book, which is that the Mets lose in the most creative ways of any team in professional sports. Now, that does not mean we're bad. We lose at various junctures. Sometimes it's a disaster of a season, and sometimes it's a playoff run that comes apart at the seams for one reason or another. That's part of the inventiveness of the losing. But what we balance it with is these periodic, often inexplicable, miraculous runs every once in a while, right? That keep all of us on our toes, expecting both disaster and miracles. And so, which doesn't seem like you should be able to do that, right? So last season, in some ways, was like it was actually a quintessential Mets season. It was just one of those periodic, strange, crazy fun runs that we've gone on before. Mets fans have experienced this sort of thing before. The difference this time is that it usually ends catastrophically. And this past season, it ended fine. You know what I mean? Yeah. We lost to a better team. There were no GOATs. You know what I mean? No one came out of that Dodgers series or out of that Mets season tainted with the fan base. We there was no Carlos Beltran on that team, right? There was no Armando Benitez on that team. There's nobody we're going to talk about as sort of the person we blame, no Kenny Rogers or something like that. And
the lowercase GOAT, you mean?
Lowercase goat, yeah, yes, the bad kind, not the one that not the acronym kind. The actual like we blame this person and they're going to live in infamy. There's no Bill
Right.
Buckner on
Yeah.
the 2024 Mets, right?
Yeah.
They just
Yeah.
lost, and
Yeah.
and and that's new. That's what was sort of defying gravity about last year's Mets team is that even though we lost, everything kind of went perfectly.
Man, it did.
It
It
was,
did.
and then it kept going because we got Juan Soto,
Right.
right? I mean that year. Oh, and the Yankees got humiliated by the Dodgers in that round. Everything somehow the Mets lost. Their season ended, and it kept getting better. This doesn't this doesn't happen, right? So, but it also does kind of happen. So it's very very Metsy season all around to me.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. People ask me about the Yankees and, having grown up in New York. And I said, the only time I root for the Yankees is when they play the Red Sox. That's it.
oh wow, yeah, 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 yeah. That's interesting that it breaks that way for you because for me it breaks the other way. I can't root for the Yankees under any circumstance. And so for me, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? Like
Okay.
the Red Sox, and also I live in Boston now.
Right.
I'm you know my wife is a Red Sox fan insofar as she's a sports aware person in Boston. Grew up here, um, and I also like some of my formative baseball memories when the Mets were middling for a little while was those epic Yankees Red Sox series. So where I was so much on the Red Sox side, hoping for those Yankees humiliations. You were on the other side. Why do you hate Boston so much?
I
Is it
mean, I think it's because of 1986.
86? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and Boston sports fans, and maybe you don't see it being on the inside, but here in New York, and I got to ask you about that. I don't know. The Boston fans have a particular tinge to them, I
Oh
guess,
yeah,
but
yeah. No, no, no. That part. Look, I have not gone over to the dark side just because I live here.
yeah,
I will admit that I like living here more than I anticipated I would. I never imagined I would live in Boston. I've been here 6 years now. I
it's a
wrote that
beautiful
book
city.
about the Mets here in Boston, which I I thought was kind of like I like sort of was subversive, it's a little subversive.
Right.
Um, but I totally hear you on the Boston fandom. I mean, it's insufferable, and dark and often irrational. It's I prefer it to Yankee culture. I will say that. Um, but I certainly know what you mean. It's if you're from New York, of course you have to have that kind of antipathy. For me, it's just very Yankee specific. Like I despise the Patriots. You know what I mean? Like I
Yeah,
despise them,
Patriots are.
and
So
so, but when it comes to the Red Sox, I can let my hatred of the Yankees overpower.
so let's contrast the Mets versus the Yankees. What
Yeah.
is it about you about the Yankees?
You mean why do I hate them so much? To put it very simply, to me it's I don't know if I chose the Mets or the Mets chose me. I think it's a little bit of both. Part of it is generational. I came of age. My baseball awareness was the mid 1980s, and at that particular moment, the Mets had a 6 foot 6 inch right fielder whose last name was Strawberry. And I was 7 years old. Like it doesn't take a lot when you're 7 years old to form deep, lifelong attachments. I couldn't believe this guy's last name was Strawberry. That was so cool, and he was a giant. Like I'd never seen anyone that tall. 6 foot 6 inches when you're 7 or 8 years old just seems so tall. And he could hit for power, and he could run, and I just wanted to be him. And then the other Mets had another pitcher who was like 20 years old and threw faster than anyone and struck everyone out, and he was amazing. And so I became a Mets fan without necessarily knowing that the defining traits were, the sort of um, the way I sort of look at everything through a funny prism or narrative storytelling underdog. I always sort of identify more with the underdog.
Yes,
Um,
me too.
you
Yeah.
know, I appreciate and enjoy the story and the journey and the hilarity of it, and the quirky characters and the oddballs. I always love those parts of a story versus the hero in the shining armor.
Right.
That character always kind of bored me,
Right.
in
The
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 story.
clean cut character and shit.
Yeah, the hero, Captain America, like that was never going to be me. Like I instinctively knew as an 8-year-old kid that I was not that kid in the cast of elementary school characters. And so I think, without even realizing that the Mets were that team in the equation with the Yankees and the Mets, um, I found the right tribe, and I learned it quick with the Mets. You know what I mean? Like, we win the 1986 World Series in the Metsiest of ways, right? And and I didn't even know this until probably decades later when I'm a grown up and I start to read about the team. They're already imploding by the time they've won the World Series. Like this Mets team is already coming apart at the seams when Jesse Orosco is throwing his glove up in the air, right? Darryl Strawberry and Davy Johnson are already not speaking to each other. Dwight Gooden is falling apart with drugs, right? Players are breaking down, hating each other. Like this team is already, a ticking time bomb. Um, and then very, very quickly, it's 1990 and 1991, and Bobby Bonilla's in town, and you have the worst team that money can buy. And and then it's years in the wilderness, and then the Yankees turn into the dominant team in sports, right? Right at the tail end of that. So I started out as high as you can go, not just winning a World Series, but winning it in this sort of thrilling, historic, miraculous fashion. I'm 10
Oh
years
yeah.
old. This sort of thing happens every year.
Right.
And it's just, like a boulder gathering momentum as it rolls downhill, each time,
Right.
each time it's just running over people as it goes, right? That's what it was like for me as a Mets fan. So that's perfect. I ended up with the right place.
I was 8 years old in 1986, and when that was the first Mets season that I watched, and I watched the whole thing from July all the way to Game 7, and it's amazing to think about. Nearly 40 years later, that was the best season was when I was 8 years old, and
Yeah.
it's only
Yeah.
been downhill from there.
It's and when you sort of dial back and you put yourself in that position, when you experience something like that, you have no capacity to believe or understand or fathom what it means that this isn't going to happen again, right? You just assume that this is what it's going to be. You just assume that this is kind of normal, or at least that it happens reasonably often. Not that you're cursed, not that you're getting, that this victory that you've been given is like fate setting you up for like a lifelong, cross to the jaw, right? It would never occur to you at 10 years old or 8 years old that this victory that you've been given, this miraculous, memorable victory, is actually a setup for a right cross to the jaw, right? For the rest of your life. And that's what it's been.
Yeah.
Um, at least that's the Metsy way to look at it, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
I mean, look,
funny.
I'm lucky that I'm getting to an age. You're getting to an age where, look, most of the Mets fans have never experienced this at all,
Right. True. True.
right? I mean, if you're below the age of 40-ish, let's call it, no, 44, you don't have any recollection of the Mets winning a World
Yeah.
Series.
Right.
That's a
right?
lot of Mets
Yeah.
fans. So, I'm beginning to feel like, those the people that I still talk to every now and then who are like, I was around for the '69 World Series. Let me tell you, like I'm starting to
Yeah.
feel like that only about
Yeah.
'86.
Yeah. It's funny. After we went to a game, my family, my two sons, and they lost, and we're getting on the escalator, or the elevator. My youngest son was still in a stroller on that point, and we get on the elevator with two old timers, and we're talking about how the Mets lost. And I turn to the two old timers, and and I say, "Yeah, it's a good life lesson for my son." They're like, "Ain't that right?"
I mean, look, I
Life
do.
is full of disappointment.
I really, I don't want to be glib about it. I think that that's real. Um, um, I think, being a Mets fan prepares you for a lot of things, not just disappointment, but to be open to the possibility of a cathartic success, right? However preposterous or haphazard it may be. And also to sort of, I know not all Mets fans are like this, because I've seen the social media clips of some of the crazy fans screaming at the TV every time something goes wrong. But to me, Mets fans are have a better sense of humor than that, and that sense of humor is sort of one of the defining things about us, is that we get the joke. And when you don't expect to win, you don't consider it a divine right. You are able to actually enjoy things along the way.
I think
That
so.
I think last year was such a crystallization of the distance difference between Mets fans and Yankee fans, and in a way that we'll probably never see again, even in the order of the Subway Series, back in 2000, in the sense that the Mets finished one round short of the World Series. We lost earlier than the Yankees, and Mets fans, that was like one of the most delightful Met seasons across the board for Mets
It
fans
really was.
to have. Like it is, after '69 and '86, people will start to argue. There will be lots of people who will consider 2024 their favorite season
Yeah.
for a long, long, long time. The Yankees made the World Series. And I know Yankee fans. I've got some very good Yankee fans friends. They led that division wire to wire, and they were miserable every single day of the season. They were miserable. And it just, like, the fan experience of those two seasons side by side, I think says just a lot about the fan bases. Yankee fans, I think, would sneer and roll their eyes and be humiliated and turn beet red at the thought of something like OMG. The thought of a utility middle infielder having a Latin pop hit song that becomes a not just a team anthem, but literally a pop hit mid-season, just out of nowhere. The Yankees fans would hate that. They'd think that's so tacky. We loved it. We just think it's delightful. The Yankee fans would lose their mind with embarrassment over the notion of Grimace, the McDonald's character, for some bizarre reason becoming like this totemic turnaround figure, like Grimace became for the Mets last year. We love that stuff. We find this absolutely delightful and hilarious, and a whole part of the reason why you play a game every single night. It's what makes a season, and they're just snorting mad with rage through that whole process. And it's like, what are we even doing this for? So to
Right.
me, like, um, that's how I looked at it last year. It's just like, man, you guys are always so mad.
I mean, do you think their expectations are just so high that when they don't win at all,
I think it goes beyond expectations. Expectations is I'm sure what they would say. It's all in the word choice, right? That's a friendly way of saying entitled, right? That's how I would describe
Right.
it. They just sort of behave like they are entitled to a World Series caliber, frankly, World Series team, and that anything less than that is like an affront to the way the world should operate, and beneath them in some kind of way, like they're anything, like they're, that's the thing, is there's the delusion of a Yankee fan that because you root for this team, you are entitled to this sort of glorious life, as a fan. Who are you? Like Mets fans I think Mets fans look at everyone and be like, you're all kind of Mets fans. You just don't know it yet, but you'll find out. The world will show you.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, that's
So
why
maybe
we're smiling, because we already know.
so maybe we could bring it back to the beginning and talk about 1962 and
Yeah,
Casey
yeah,
Stengel, in
yeah.
particular, just because he was somebody that did win so many championships with the Yankees, but he's remembered for being the Mets' first coach more than anything else.
Yeah, this is sort of one of the kind of where my book began, was this notion that, we've spent this whole time talking about who the Mets fans are, the Mets, this identity that's very distinct and that we all sort of recognize as Mets fans. Well, where does it come from? Like, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. And it doesn't just come from losing, right? There are a lot of losing teams out there that don't have this kind of identity. And a big part of it is Casey Stengel, the original sort of, godfather or father of the Mets, who, you know, if you want to talk about a Metsy rewriting of history for a person's biography, take a guy who is an icon in baseball, one of the most popular and famous figures in baseball, for winning countless World Series with the New York Yankees. Greatest, team, DiMaggio, Mantle, those Yankees dominating a decade, and then gets run out because he's too old, and takes a job running the Mets, this embarrassment of a franchise, expansion franchise. And he's picked mostly because he's the star. Nobody's going to know any of the players. The players are all crappy expansion players that nobody else wanted. He's the star. So he can't resist that. And he ends up getting defined in baseball memory by this one team in 1962 that lost all of these games. And he's making jokes about them the whole time. And no one remembers the dominant Yankee legendary run that he had. That's a pretty Metsy arc, to begin your franchise with. And, if you look at the reasons why Casey Stengel was chosen, it's not just because he was famous. It's because he was funny and charismatic and could entertain. And the people who owned the Mets, who launched the Mets, one person really, Joan Whitney Payson, the founding owner of the Mets, had the wisdom and egolessness to understand that this team was not going to be good. They were not going to win games. They were not going to bring people into the seats by being the Yankees. They needed to be fun. They needed to be joyful. They needed to be entertaining and watchable. And that's been baked into our ethos from the very beginning. Right? This idea that being a Mets fan was appreciating characters like Marvelous Marv Throneberry, who was famous for hitting doubles and forgetting to step on first. Right? And then, he was a cloddish, clumsy, but hilariously lovable baseball player. And Mets fans love those kinds of players. We like those. We love those guys, like Yankee fans like Aaron Judge, right? And our history is filled with oddball characters like this, and they become genuine heroes to us because we see them as not that different from us. We feel really connected to them. And so Casey Stengel is puts that right there in the DNA from the very beginning. In fact, the title of my book, "So Many Ways to Lose," is sort of a paraphrase of a Casey Stengel line where he was talking to a reporter that he talked about how this Mets team keeps finding new ways to lose. That was one of his lines. And so that DNA is sort of carried through for 60 years, right? There's franchises do have identities, right? That's a real thing. They can change, they morph. The Mets might be in a morphing phase right now, identity-wise as a franchise, but we're always going to be fundamentally Metsy and Mets fans. Things are gonna go wrong, and what defines you is how you react to it and how you process it. And we're always going to do it in the Metsiest way. And that's because of Casey Stengel. We all learned it from Casey, right back in the beginning. But what flows from there is the other side of the Mets coin, right? Is this team starts in 1962 with what was until last year a major league record for most lost.
It was.
Chicago White Sox knocked us half out of the books. We still have the worst losing percentage.
Right, losing percentage. They
right?
Lost one more game.
Yeah, they lost one more game, but our winning percentage is worse than theirs. So
we're still the losers.
We share the belt. And then 7 years later, they win a World Series. Miracle Mets. You go from 140 and 120, one of the most hilariously, cartoonishly, comically, historically bad teams in sports. 7 years later, they're the champions of the world. That's the other side of the Mets coin, right? Out of nowhere, sometimes we shoot the moon. And that part of the history got baked in right at the beginning, too.
Right. And very apt metaphor as well. 1969, shooting the moon.
Shooting the moon, yeah. I mean, and I always wonder what that must have, been like in that moment in New York. There's a game that Tom Seaver pitched. He threw a one-hitter that season in July. It was right around the lunar landing, and he struck out something like 14 guys, and it was when the Mets were really flipping the switch, and the stadium was packed. And I've often thought that if there was like any Mets game before my birth that I could travel back and go to, I would want to be there for that night, because not just for the Metsiness of it, but just where the world was in that moment, knowing what was going on. It must have been electric. And to think of coming from that 7 years earlier, the joke of sports, right? And of course, the Mets, the next year they went right back to mediocrity, right? They were terrible, but they went right back to mediocrity. And then 71, they went mediocre again. 72, mediocre again, right? Like, and with the same problem all 3 years is they had no hitters and they somehow never fixed it, right? And then in 1973, they shoot the moon again, right? They are in last place on August 1st at a time when there was only two divisions, right? So you had 6 teams ahead of you, or 5 teams ahead of you. Last place on August 1st. And they go all the way to Game 7 of the World Series and lose to Reggie Jackson and the dynasty Oakland A's. Again, not just making a playoff run, but doing it in the Metsiest of ways, right? And almost knocking off the juggernaut in the end. But in that particular scene, that was the "you gotta believe" Mets. That's that phrase, right. "You gotta believe," which is so associated with the Mets, was coined during that run by Tug McGraw in the clubhouse after the Mets sort of hit rock bottom and they needed to be motivated. Um, and it's funny, a lot of the players thought he was losing his mind. And they thought it was ridiculous at the time. And it just sort of caught on, caught on, caught on, caught on. And um, that's that's what are we talking about? We're like 11 years into the franchise's history, and you've got like a very clear identity laid out for who you're going to be. Like it's this, you could see a lot of parallels between a season like 1973 and 2024. Just improbable. The feeling that you're playing with house money the whole way. That's us. It's still us.
So we talked about some characters. I mean, Lenny Dykstra comes to mind. A lot of the players on the 1986 season. Maybe we could jump to 1986 and talk a little bit about that.
I mean, cast the characters is sort of like the best way to look at it because, that '86 team, I think, is one of the great lessons on how time shifts your perception and your understanding of what reality was and what happened in history. Right? Like, I was 10 years old. All of these guys were just these wild, hilarious, freakish, nutso, lovable characters who, from the outside, I assumed everything was hunky dory, and they were just gonna, they were all happy, healthy baseball players, who loved each other. And, and you learn about all the, Lenny Dykstra, coming in with all of this ego and attitude and crassness and effectively, during the championship run, taking away the job of the most tenured veteran Met in Mookie Wilson, who ends up, of course, becoming one of the heroes of the World Series. But, Mookie, who is a sweet, beloved, God-fearing, penitent man, this clash with Lenny Dykstra, who was, soon to be an actual convicted criminal down the road. I mean, just one of the all-time trash human beings. Turns out in baseball history. And you have like guys like Keith Hernandez, who you see as like this leader on the field and is very much so in the clubhouse. But it's also a very volatile thing, right? Like he's constantly clashing with Darryl Strawberry, and Strawberry's constantly pushing back on him. There's always fights, and everybody's always arguing. And you've got Gary Carter, who's this, constantly smiling, always doing commercials. He's the catcher, power hitting catcher on the team. He seems like this gregarious, happy-go-lucky guy. On the rest of the team, they all think that he's an attention hog and constantly sucking up for cameras and trying to get endorsement money. And he and Keith Hernandez are fighting over who should be the captain of the team and who's the real leader. Like all of these things, then there's guys like Kevin Mitchell, who came from a really rough part of San Diego and who actually, in the minor leagues during a pickup basketball game, actually knocked out Darryl Strawberry cold during a basketball game. Kevin Mitchell, very tough guy. A lot of the guys on the team were a very sweet guy, but if you pushed the wrong buttons with him, a lot of the guys on the team were afraid of him. In fact, it's one of the reasons why they ended up trading one of their most talented young power hitters. Just this collection of powder kegs, really. And, they just threw a Molotov cocktail in there. So boom, 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 all of these characters. And, you could see that as a 10-year-old, but you didn't understand the combustibility and the, the human, the drugs and the steroids and the alcohol and the partying. Obviously, as a 10-year-old, they just look like guys having fun.
Right.
Now and that's what that team was. So this was this miraculous run. The team was a juggernaut. Like they won 108 games. They ran away from the division, and then they get to the playoffs, and they need a lot of Metsy miracles to win both of these playoff series, but they do. And that team is immortalized forever. But like I said earlier, they were melting down, before they even finished off the World Series. I mean, one of the most famous and unfortunate stories about that World Series run happens during the ticker tape parade a few days afterward, because Dwight Gooden, Dr. K, the amazing, dynamite, world famous young starting pitcher that the Mets had, wasn't there because he was strung out on cocaine. He was, at his dealer's house. So, and his teammates had no idea where he was. So, as the ticker tape parade to celebrate this World Series is happening, the seeds are already there, right? And that becomes sort of your next lesson in Metsiness, right?
That's so true. Yeah. That, you had said, I mean, that basically became the beginning of his downward spiral when he missed that ticker tape parade.
Yeah, that was the first moment when it publicly was clear that there was an issue. Something was wrong. It was noticed that he was not there. Players did not know that he was not there. And even in a media environment like you had in the 1980s, where really all you've got is beat reporters, newspaper beat reporters. But that's enough for something like this to start to bubble up. And I think in the beat, in the beat reporting universe, I don't think none of these guys were particularly surprised. They knew what was going on with a lot of these players,
Right.
And it was bound to break out into the open. There were warning signs during the World Series. It has often been rumored that Dwight Gooden didn't start Game 7, wasn't given the opportunity to start Game 7 because Davey Johnson didn't trust that he was clean enough.
Wow.
To handle it. We don't know if that's the case, but I'm sure it was a consideration. Right. Davey knew what was going on, and so these are things that that was sort of a really shattering moment for me as a baseball fan, a really sobering moment for me, because I can't remember if at that age I heard about Dwight Gooden not being there for the ticker tape parade.
I don't remember it.
November of 1986. I can't remember if I knew that or not.
Yeah.
But I do remember the following spring, at the beginning of spring training, when it was announced that Gooden was going into drug rehab and that he was not going to be starting the season. Right. That was like it's 86 is over. Right. That is in the past. But also you're a 10-year-old coming off this high. Sorry, that's a terrible choice of words. Of winning this World Series, and this is Reagan era. Say no to drugs, Nancy Reagan. If you so much as come within 5 feet of like a touch of powder of cocaine, you'll die. Right. That was what you were sort of taught as 10-year-olds in this era. And now your hero pitcher, right, is apparently hooked on it and is suspended from baseball. That was a really like shattering kind of moment and it was kind of all downhill from there for the Mets. I mean, they got back to the NLCS the next year in '88, but that was sort of the last blip.
A long time, yeah. And I mean, Doc had extensive drug issues and in and out of rehab, and there was that ESPN 30 for 30 with what was it called, the
Doc and Darryl,
Doc and Darryl, yeah,
because Darryl Strawberry, they were sort of reinforcing each other's behavior. Strawberry, that's this player who's the reason I came to love the Mets in the first place.
Yeah, me too. Yeah,
sort of goes down a similar path as Gooden. Very, very similar parallel stories. Darryl recovers better although comes much closer to the brink because of his health issues. He ends up, nearly dying of cancer. Um, um, Both end up in the Yankees. Both end up winning additional World Series rings.
Yeah, which is crazy.
Like, come on, like this is what it is to be a Mets fan, right?
Yeah.
Being a Mets fan means watching your two childhood heroes, the two reasons that you became a Mets fan, win redemptive, career capping World Series rings with the Yankees. At a moment when your team is just the worst, right? Just the worst. Your team had turned their backs on these guys. George Steinbrenner redeems them. They win World Series. I mean, Yankees carried Dwight Gooden off the field on their shoulders that night that he threw the no-hitter. Threw a no-hitter with the Yankees, not with the Mets. Never
Not
did
with
that
the
with the
Mets.
Mets. Right. Like that's what it is to be a Mets fan. But that's also what it is to be a person every once in a while, every now and then. So
I mean, do you think that was done out of spite on behalf of Steinbrenner and the Yankees bringing on these two Mets stars onto their
absolutely.
roster?
I'm 2% serious. I motivations are complicated. I very much believe that in both cases, Steinbrenner largely did this out of the goodness of his heart, and 2% of him did it to stick it to the Mets.
Yeah, yeah.
He
Turn the
was
screw
very,
on.
very conscious. It is not lost on him that his decency and magnanimity in this occasion would be extra painful to Mets fans. There's no way he was unaware of that. And for that, I will always despise him even more than I already did. That was really, really, really hard to watch. That was really hard to watch.
Yeah, yeah. It's very, very strange. But I mean, in the same way as Casey Stengel, I mean, do you think that Dwight Gooden and Darryl Strawberry will be remembered in history for their time on the Yankees or as Mets players?
No, they'll be remembered as Mets.
Yeah,
Um, and I think that that's how they identify.
I
You
think
know,
so too. Yeah.
I think Darryl Strawberry identifies very much as a Met. He's in the Mets Hall of Fame. He's not in the Yankees Hall of Fame.
Right.
Um, you know, um,
Higher barrier to
yeah, a little
entry
bit
to the
higher
Yankees
bar,
Hall.
I suppose. But I do think that um, it's like careers are modern baseball careers are long and complicated now. Um, you know, it is much less weird now than it was then. It is the other thing, right? We are
That's
so
true.
used
Yeah.
to, Luka Doncic is a Laker now. You know what I mean? Like it's just like we're just it's. I think we're a little bit less naive about that part of it,
Yeah.
and um, it's certainly a bigger chapter of their story than a footnote. It's not like like a play, like a player like Willie Mays, and even in the last year or two of his career playing for the Mets when he's a Giants. This whole like no, they did significant things with those teams. It wasn't just a footnote. They won World Series rings, but they're still Mets. They're Mets
Yeah.
fundamentally. They're ours.
And maybe we can turn to one of the constants that's been through it all, and particularly dating back to 1986. We've got Gary, Keith, and Ron,
And Gary, Keith, and Ron. Yeah.
the best in the business.
Mhm. Mm. Sorry. Yes. The best in the business. I say not necessarily listening to other booths very often. Although I'm familiar with the ones that I did that I know everybody thinks are great, like particularly the Giants booth. I know everybody loves the Giants booth, um, and every opportunity I get, which isn't many, I listen to them. But I'm still going to go with Gary, Keith, and Ron, just not just for the game calls, but just for the oddity and singularity of their dynamic and banter, and the role that each of them played, the distinctness of their characters, and the way that they are tough on the team, in a way that I've listened to the Yankee announcers, they never are. Um, um, and they're engaged. Even, they there are a lot of times and there are a lot of Mets seasons that, it's August, we're out of the playoff race and they've still got to do their job and they make a
Yeah,
lot
they
a lot
do.
of
I mean, it's so, and half the time I'm watching for them, not
yeah, I mean,
particularly during those times.
that's and look, that's I think that's nobody's sticking with a Yankee game, um because of that booth.
Yeah.
Sort of 9-man, I don't know, it seems like it's 70 people who are in there, but um it, it- that's a part of the sort of Met fan, approach to life and approach to being a baseball fan is sometimes there are going to be seasons when you're eliminated in August, or September. And Mets fans, I think, are much more skilled at Yankee fans at finding reasons to still love your team and lock in. Whether it's like the emergence of a couple rookies or some character who's having just sort of a special season for whatever reason. I feel like Mets fans are really good at identifying those things and savoring them and enjoying them, um, in ways that you learn to do when you're frankly not focused on expecting to entitled to winning. You know, I don't say that's off the table, but when that's not the only reason you're here, you can start to enjoy some other things.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. Maybe we could turn to some of the most Metsy things ever happened. Bernie Madoff, Bobby
Yeah,
Bonilla Day. Let's start with our favorite holiday as Mets fans on July 1 of every year. Maybe you
yeah,
could
Bobby
talk us
Bonilla.
through that.
Yeah, so um, Bobby Bonilla was a highly touted, highly coveted free agent, um, who had already, um, uh, had one disastrous stint with the Mets, um, in which he repeatedly underperformed, or at least started out underperforming and then actually performed relatively well, but got off on the wrong foot with New York. Really got off on the wrong foot with the media and never sort of righted it. Always went from a very smiling, happy, contented guy to just glowering, miserable, and, um, argumentative, and got traded out of town. For some reason, the Mets brought him back in
All
1999,
right. Right.
and, um, they, after the 1999 season, um, they wanted to get rid of him. Um, but he still had some money left on his contract. And the Mets wanted to use that money to go get a pitcher. Felt like, they'd made a playoff run in 1999, even with Bonilla mostly on the bench. And they felt like they were a pitcher away from really contending, which it turned out they were right. Um, but in order to clear up the money in their budget, they needed to get rid of Bobby Bonilla because they already had a very, very expensive team. And so they, um, offered Bobby Bonilla basically a deal by which they would get rid of his contract by taking that money and paying it to him as kind of an annuity, a little over $1 million every year for 25 years, beginning in 2011. And this was in 1999. So basically, they were agreeing to pay him $1 million or so a year for 25 years in the future just to leave, get out of town, go away. And Bobby Bonilla said yes. And so the Mets used that money, um, uh, to um, uh, the Mets used that money to sign a pitcher named Mike Hampton, really good starter for the Houston Astros. He ended up being an ace for the Mets in 2000. The Mets ended up going to the World Series in
Yeah.
2000.
Yeah.
Um, involved in the transaction to get rid of Bobby Bonilla. The Mets ended up getting a compensatory draft pick. That draft pick was David Wright, who turned into a cornerstone of the Mets franchise for the next decade. By all rights, the Bobby Bonilla transaction was a huge success.
Right, right.
Worked out great for everyone. Bonilla got a great deal. The Mets got the pitcher they wanted. They went to the World Series. Fast forward 12 years, though, and it's 2011. And now it's time to start paying Bobby Bonilla his $1 million check every year. And this is the exact moment when America learns about a man named Bernie Madoff. And it turns out that a huge percentage of the Mets ownership's money, owned by the Wilpon family, very, very, very close friends with Bernie Madoff and their family. Sons are best friends. Turns out all of his money is gone now. The Mets appear to be bankrupt, and they are so broke that that year in 2011, Bobby Bonilla was technically the highest paid outfielder on the Mets roster for a certain even though he had not played a baseball game for the Mets in more than a decade. So that was a big reason why this came to be such a humiliating thing, was not just because the Mets were giving $1 million check to a guy that the entire city of New York hated and who hated them right back, but that they were doing it at a time when the franchise was so broke because of this massive fraud that they could barely make a payroll.
Right. It's just a slap in the face.
Yeah, it was the timing as much as anything. Because as Shohei Ohtani has taught us in recent years, with his crazy contract, is something like I can't even remember. It's like $700 million, but he's only getting paid $2 million a year, right? Because tons of it is deferred money. This sort of deal, deferrals, is not unusual. In fact, it wasn't even that unusual back when Bobby Bonilla did it. There are plenty of other Mets still getting money from the team, and this was a common thing. Not that common, but it's basically an annuity, and it was not that unusual in the league, not that unheard of. But the particular circumstances around this one turned it into a sort of symbolic moment annually for Mets, folly and self-sabotage. So on July 1, every year, it has come to be known as Bobby Bonilla Day. We pay because that's the day he gets his $1 million check. And this was, sort of a anti-holiday of sorts for a very long time. Something that the team obviously did not acknowledge with the previous ownership, something that Bobby Bonilla did not acknowledge. But now that Steve Cohen has taken over, and it's not his.
Right. It's not his folly. It's somebody else's.
Somebody else's. Now the team can embrace it. Now we can enjoy it. Now we can all smile, especially since history has sort of eased the wound of what a deal like this really is. But, now Bobby Bonilla is back in the embrace of the Mets. All is forgiven. He's welcomed back into the fold, and, he's showing up at the games, and we celebrate Bobby Bonilla Day all together now. Not sort of, on the sly or surreptitiously or subversively. But that's a Mets moment that even non-Mets fans seem to be very, very aware of. They seem to be familiar with the idea that we have a holiday celebrating a player who effectively fleeced us, even though he didn't really.
Well, I mean, the real fleece, of course, was the Madoffs. And how much money of the Wilpons did they take?
I would have to look it up. Hundreds of millions of dollars.
And the Mets, it happens to the Mets of all teams.
Yeah. And there was and of course the whole time that Bernie Madoff is being prosecuted, there's this, the the Wilpon family is being scrutinized very, very carefully too. In fact, the Madoff prosecutors and the people clawing back the money are convinced that the Wilpons had to be in on it somehow because they were such close friends and they were such avid investors and the families were so intertwined. There's no way no one could be stupid enough was the prevailing prosecution theory. And of course, Mets fans are looking at this and being like, "Oh no, we totally believe they were duped."
Yeah, yeah,
Totally
yeah. I mean,
that checks out. That checks.
I mean, it's very sad that essentially their defense was that we're idiots.
Yes, that literally was their defense. They were not guilty. They were duped. I can't imagine he anticipated the sort of valuation boom that professional sports franchises have undergone in the last decade and a half. But that's a big reason why they sold the team, right? His family, his children wanted the money, and they were starting to get concerned that his son Jeff, who is running the Mets, and is probably the most loathed figure in Mets history, was running the team into the ground and might eventually squander all their money if they didn't sell sooner rather than later. So they cashed out, and that's how we ended up with Uncle Stevie Cohen.
So Jeff Wilpon, can you talk about him?
Yeah, the ne'er-do-well son is such a classic. I don't even know if it's fair to say American business archetype. It's probably a global business archetype. It's probably a historic archetype, the ne'er-do-well son. But we've, with Succession and the Murdochs and, we have seen these characters lampooned in pop culture to the point where I feel like we know who Jeff Wilpon is. We've seen this character before. He's the pale imitation of the father who made the company out of nothing, right? Which is very much what Fred Wilpon did. Fred Wilpon was the very accomplished college baseball player whose career was derailed by injury. Jeff was never an athlete of any consequence. Just like Jeff is foolish, thin-skinned, awkward, impulsive, and all the things that you sort of get from being the rich guy's son. And there was there's this sort of slightly incorrect stereotype about Jeff Wilpon and his tenure sort of running the Mets, which is mostly in the 2010s when he's really taken over in the sort of post Bernie Madoff phase, that he was cheap and they wouldn't spend any money. And that actually isn't true. I mean, the Mets spent lots of money. Oftentimes it was the way they spent money. It was so reckless and haphazard and indecisively and unstrategically. They'd go from wild splurges to the splurges would blow up in their face, and then all of a sudden they wouldn't spend anything for a couple of years. It was all impulsive, no strategy, thoughtless, and that was Jeff. That was Jeff Wilpon, and even his family seemed to get sick of it because it was his siblings were really the driving force behind the family divesting and selling the team right around the pandemic. He wanted to keep it, but it seemed like the longer he owned the team, the more he was hurting it.
And so, can you talk about Steve Cohen and his purchase of the Mets and where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, for a journalist like me, I was always very ambivalent about someone like Steve Cohen, right? He's the popular lore about him is that the lead character in Billions, that show about the hedge fund financier Damian Lewis, is based on him. Steve Cohen does not look anything like Damian Lewis. Very, 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 very different physical types. But a, a guy who sort of runs roughshod over um, the financial laws of the land, and got filthy rich in the process, but did get caught and slapped on the wrist and banned from trading and all that stuff. There's a Jane Mayer investigative book all about him and how he and his various financial misdeeds and habits. Um, but he's also worth something like $20 billion, and now he's going to be the richest owner in baseball. And it means we can buy whomever we want and outspend the Yankees and flip this whole script. And now we can be the best team in baseball because no one can outgun us anymore. Um, that was the theory. It was a bit like we were selling our souls. But when your team is already the Mets and you're being run by Fred Wilpon and the Wilpon family, it's kind of like, who are you fooling?
A wash. Yeah.
Like, what's so special about the devil, Um, and I think when Cohen took over, I think the Mets fans got adorably optimistic that everything that they had known the Mets for being, our DNA was going to sort of get scrubbed, reprogrammed, and we were just going to turn into this, dynastic juggernaut that spent and spent and spent and spent and spent. And some of the spending has been true. Cohen has spent a lot of money, but he's also assembled what was probably the second worst team money goodbye in 2023, the highest payroll ever for something like 75 wins and a fourth place finish. Money doesn't buy you everything. Sports fans know that. But I think Mets fans have been won over by the way in which he's such a polar opposite from the Wilpons, and that he is so methodical and strategic and so smart about the business and the financial side and the deal making, and he seems to hire the right people. There's an eerie sense of competence seeping into the Mets organization that's unsettling to me and pounding. It's putting to the test my strong belief that the Mets will always be the Mets, that the DNA will never change, that we will still find new ways to lose somehow because that's what we do. It'll just be different. But these guys do seem to know what they're doing. And so, Steve, we call him Uncle Stevie. I mean, it's, he's everybody's favorite uncle right now. And we'll see how long that lasts. This season could it easily put that to the test. There's already some things that are going wrong in very Metsy ways that seem like things are going to be back to business as usual after the anomaly of 2024. But we'll see. Right. Maybe we're just good now. I know a lot of Mets fans are grappling with that psychological possibility that maybe we're just good now. But I don't buy it.
I mean, spring is a time for renewal, and spring training just began this past weekend, and Mets lost a couple of games. What's your prognosis for 2025? What do you see?
Well, that's the thing about Mets fans. I really think this is our year. I really think this is going to be the year we win the World Series.
Really? Wow.
I've also thought that every year for the last 40 some odd years since 1980. And one of these years I'm going to be right.
Yeah, there you go.
Eventually I'm going to be right. But at the same time, in the back of my mind, in the pit of my gut, I'm seeing, starters go on the DL and get MRIs.
Already. Right.
And I'm like, I've seen this movie before. Here we go. So it is possible to have both of those notions in your head at the same time. That's what it is to be a Mets fan. So yes, I believe we're going to win the World Series, and I'm simultaneously waiting for the bottom to fall out.
And in the meantime, I will be sure not to gift your book to anybody until November.
Well, now might be the perfect time. Now's the perfect time. Now is when we need our expectations measured.
That's right. There you go. Well, Devin, the author of the book, So Many Ways to Lose. How can people find out more about you? What are you working on?
By day, I'm a magazine journalist. I write for places like the New York Times Magazine, the Atlantic. I just published a long project in Esquire about what young men in America are thinking in the post-election world. And if you go to Fortune, I've got a cover story about the new CEO of Nike. So I'm out there if you look for me.
Excellent. All right. Well, Devin, it's great having you on the show.
All right. This has been fun. Thank you so much for having
All
me.
right. Same here.